Please take it away, sir.
Thanks. And thank you, Doug. I'm really delighted to kick off this session and excited to see, what we come up with this range of papers this morning. So thank you so much for bringing us together. Home to both art history and studio majors, and I do feel like a strange duck as the art historian here. Furman University's art department is reframing the role of an arts education as a path which cultivates an in-demand entrepreneurial mindset, including flexibility and creativity, which of course is required in this economy. Our point is that without radical reconfiguration, we've affirmed the importance of the arts within the liberal arts education and emphasized both its intrinsic richness and its practical applications outside of academia. So this is a progress report, capturing the student-based experiences that have informed our transition, some of the steps we've taken in reframing the art department, and the assessment models that are being developed and implemented right now. We know that employable outcomes are important to students and parents. Does it really pay to go to a small liberal arts college and study art? When students are making these decisions, they're making them with limited knowledge of actual career paths and how they'll actually need to navigate professional pathways and networks. They're usually comfortable, as you can see in this graphic, in departments that have a sort of direct career path. You major in business, you work in business. You major in accounting, you become an accountant. You follow a pre-med track, and then you follow a medical track. And there's a sort of runway there. They don't think about art. And part of this is our fault. If we're going to remain stuck in that sort of popular conception of art being this out of the ordinary, autonomous sphere of creative genius and sort of innate talent, we've got to change that conversation while still embracing our core values and aspiring to understand, in the words of the art critic Jerry Saltz, creativity as a survival skill. And to know that as students exercise that creative muscle, they're going to build confidence, they're going to push for bolder ideas and more ambitious innovation. And this is one way that we have an inside track. The arts have an unfair advantage in the fact that our skills are self-reinforcing. So while addressing the career-mindedness of our students, we felt confident that we could assure them of the skills and competencies that are being developed when they study art without radically altering our practice. We felt we could balance the pragmatic, so understanding and providing what both students, parents, and employers want and need, with our sort of moral imperative to provide an education that we felt supported a student's vocation. And I mean vocation in like the larger sense here. So design thinking really served as our primary model for curriculum design and has trickled down then into the structure and execution of our courses. We felt that by following a circuit of empathy, definition, ideation, prototyping, testing, and implementation, we were going to tackle some of the pressing issues facing an arts education at a time when departments are always asked to justify themselves, whether overtly or not. And also to tackle some of the issues of a liberal arts institution where we're asking parents to pay tuition and want to produce a deliverable, all while preserving our primary identity as an art department with the integral respect we have for our field. As others have said, entrepreneurship doesn't need to replace arts training. There's a natural symbiosis. So what do employers need? Well, we all know that. Contrary to student and parent perceptions of professional education, employers are increasingly emphasizing the need for flexibility, creativity, communication skills over discipline-specific training. And when you look at these trending skills, these are the skills you learn in making art, whether you take a single class, whether you take a series of courses, whether you get a degree. It's this sort of entrepreneurial mindset that enhances your career prospects and that we teach on a daily basis. But we have to get them in the door. Talented, smart, curious, resilient, and driven students on our campus have been talked out of art, told that it was frivolous or a waste of time or certain to lead to underemployment. But the intersectional thinking that we encourage in liberal arts education, and which is undeniably a critical feature for innovation and leadership today, is also at the heart of the art practice. I mean, it's the way an art historian understands how and why artists have worked. So by emphasizing the process of creation and interpretation, not just a checklist of facts or techniques to master, we've tried to focus on that process of thinking. And we found that reducing barriers has worked. Right now, non-majors outnumber studio majors in our 100 and our 200 level courses. Opening up our major has encouraged students with divergent interests to make art. And then we encourage them to integrate their other areas of growing expertise and think how this impacts and creates a unique position. What we're teaching doesn't have a disciplinary boundary, and it gives our students an edge. For our department, a real aha moment was at an unlikely spot, a 2012 American Society for Engineering Education Northeast Section Conference at the University of Massachusetts at Lowell, where Professor McClain, my colleague, and a group of students facilitated a workshop on design thinking with engineers who were doing fascinating research, but had difficulty talking about their work and making it relevant to a general audience because they hadn't been trained to craft the sort of inspirational or empathetic, effective narrative that we teach. And it was a moment we realized we can prepare our students to fill that role if we're willing to make art a place where students learn how to make connections between ideas and people, and if we're willing to make art a place about creativity and imagination, to make problem solvers and communicators in a way that's not just about following a traditional degree model. To do this, we've really encouraged the department on an individual level to highlight imagination and creativity so that our studio courses focus on generating ideas, not just improving technique, and it's really become an ethos. Our art history courses emphasize methodology or critical thinking over just the simple mastery of canonical knowledge. There are sacrifices, but we feel they're worth them. We ensure students are learning necessary material, but we stress making and creating over perfection. To help students connect their art department experiences to the bigger picture, we've also helped students understand how these are reinforcing disciplines and how just the joy of making and generating knowledge crosses over these departmental lines. One of the ways that we're doing this is by helping our students focus more on the experiential process within our department. And so to help them connect their art experiences to their bigger university picture, we've developed these experiential major maps for both studio and art history that help make these connections and these pathways visible. We found out that students understood what they were supposed to learn in the major, but they rarely understood like what that meant, what the value of that was beyond just a GPA. And so since we developed this major map, actually the initiative's been picked up by Furman and university-wide. We've now developed a core set of sort of meta competencies that we believe are larger, not really competencies, but larger characteristics developed over the 4 years. And then we can articulate within that the value our department brings. Other elements of the major map show a sort of pathway through the 4 years, how students have built on their studies and moved into a postgraduate world. But most importantly, this really showcases the experiences and the skills that enable our art students to, on a practical level, maximize their educational investment, but also to help them realize and to comprehend that they're really cultivating skills that will make them flexible, creative innovators and leaders. And so while these components are embedded into individual courses, we also emphasize in these major maps extracurricular activities that help to create that synthesis between short-term projects and long-term learning objectives. Across the board, these major maps and changes in departmental language help us not just articulate to students what they will learn to do in a class, but what they'll do with that knowledge, and then giving them opportunities for that. So for example, our Sleep When You're Dead 24-hour brand marathon and pitch competition was created 4 years ago to build a platform for students in different majors, not just art, to intersect and solve creative problems. So in this 24 hours, students are given a creative brief and they stay up all night to create some deliverable in the form of a professional presentation deck and built prototypes. They present to a panel of judges who then award prizes based on a team's ability to solve the creative brief, the challenge presented there. The highest honor is the Innovation Award, which is given to the team that not only answers the creative brief, but creates a product that addressed other needs within the marketplace that were not part of that brief. And then that Innovation Award winner moves the team to the university-wide Paladin pitch competition, where they develop a business plan that's eligible for up to $10,000 in seed money to develop their concept. So we started this process 4 years ago. In 2020, our pitch competition drew additional funding from community investors and was the largest such event in the state, providing a really highly visible stage for the kind of interdisciplinary and creative-based entrepreneurial spirit that we hope our students understand. In 2019 at Furman, we extended this interdisciplinary sort of team-based approach with the inauguration of a graduate program in strategic design. This is a Master of Arts program, so it differs from traditional MFA programs in that professional development components and artistic training are integrated with theory, a sort of liberal arts collaboration between communication studies, English, and business, led by the art department with input from Furman's Office of Innovation and Entrepreneurship. And so students in the program build a professional practice, but overtly are developing principles of curiosity, of experimentation, of innovation in a format designed to produce leaders. Our program has also developed new curriculum to support sort of that direct approach to teaching entrepreneurship or to cultivating entrepreneurship within a department, including a business-based course, Success in the Arts, that roadmapped practical paths within creative fields. This was a new course offered last year, and it drew students from a wide range of majors, suggesting that the message the art department has been seeding, this idea of arts being an important benefit regardless of your degree path, is effective and is beginning to shift campus perceptions of arts education and asserting the importance of creative training. In 2019, we also began collaboration with the estate of a local artist. And so through undergraduate researchers in the summer and then an internal university grant that funded student fellows and a special topics course, students conducted primary research and curated an exhibition with a published catalog. This teaches practical skills, and we can help students make that connection pretty directly, but it's more than a matter of just, we want to create an entrepreneurial mindset. And so while these students did the same kinds of exercises you'd find in a typical art history course, we changed the way these projects were framed to emphasize the students' agency, the creative process of archival research, visual interpretation. There was very little published on this artist, and so we helped the students to really understand they were generating new knowledge, right? A typical project management course that, we would usually expect students to learn to manage their time over writing a research paper. Well, that takes on a new level of unpredictability when you're working with an archive. And so the students learned skills and helped to articulate skills of that project management in a more fluid and realistic fashion. All of which was supported with the university's internship program director, who helped our students then articulate these learned skills and translate them into their resumes and cover letters. To assess the impact of these changes, we're also partnering with the university's Office of Institutional Assessment and Research to develop some tools that will capture information on how these changes have actually worked on the ground. In addition, we're developing a scale based on the communication skills attitude scale, and that's the document you see on the right-hand side. This original survey was developed, in 2000 to track the impact of communication skills while teaching within a medical school setting. We chose it because it's an interdisciplinary competency-based approach. And in measuring the importance of communication skills within clinical training, their trajectory is similar to what we anticipate. Initial skepticism, an appreciation for more complexity, and then a recognition of the importance of training as a transferable skill with deep implications for professional practice. And our students are now entering a world that will increasingly demand them to hone their professional survival skills. While we acknowledge the significance and the tragedy of the COVID-19 crisis, for us in education, it's a moment to assess our position and priorities. With the shift to remote education, we had to reassess our learning objectives and focus on what was most important. And it wasn't about oil paint or clay. It was about problem solving, resilience, creativity, self-determination. And so as we look to an uncertain future, we believe the arts are uniquely poised to make these lessons more central. And these are skills our students will need. They are skills that they will appreciate. And they are skills that will produce graduates who don't just think like us, but who will be flexible in the changing decades to come. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. Okay, so we've got some time, a couple minutes here for some questions. You can raise your hand, the little blue hand in Zoom land, and I'll call on you. Or we can, well, let's just do it that way. Rachel, you're up, or you can chat with me.
Hey, thank you for your paper, Sarah. One of the things that, as a social scientist, thinking about how this works out kind of in aggregate across arts graduates or within arts education, one of the concerns that we come up against is how to integrate these new competencies or new skills into an already existing curriculum. And I'm sure that I think that Jeremy and Alex will both be talking about this within their papers too, but I'd love to hear your kind of approach to that or your reflections on that, because it seems like you've integrated a lot of new things.
We have, and I mean, there are certain things. So I should say our program shifted from, we've always been a Bachelor of Arts. So we don't offer a BFA degree. Until 2008, roughly, however, our degree was very closely modeled on that BFA model. And so we did have to make a significant shift about 12 years ago, which we did have to let go of certain things. And we have decided that those are hallmarks of our department, and that's a sort of calling card now that we're going to cultivate more than just technique. And so that's become part of our identity. But also in these last few years, as we've really attacked this question of entrepreneurship and that mindset, we found that micro changes and changes in the language have been really effective. And so I published a short piece. I teach a survey class, as I'm sure many of us do, every semester. And just simply emphasizing and adding in targeted exercises about visual literacy raised student awareness on their takeaway from the course and helped them to draw that connection. Simply, first of all, naming that visual literacy was a skill to be cultivated, and likening it to the way that you take an English class so that you can learn to interpret a poem, that automatically entered in that competency as something that we were going to cultivate over the semester. And then we did things, and sometimes they were as short as a 5-minute exercise. Sometimes it was a 20-minute exercise. Those small insertions have made a big difference. And I think the same is true in the studio practice as well.
Great, thank you.
Nice. All right, Jeremy, and then we'll try to get to Neil. So we got to unmute you, Jeremy.
Sorry, I did the spacebar thing and I had a different window open. So hopefully mine's really quick. I noticed in the paper that you chose a set of competencies from the NACE, and I don't remember offhand what that stands for. But I was wondering what the reasoning was behind the choice of those set of competencies. You know, there's a lot of competency sets we could pick.
Yes, well, part of that was driven simply by institutional preference. So there was already an initiative on campus that was relying on those NACE competencies. And then since the art department piloted its major map and it's been picked up institutionally, we've been refining those competencies to sort of make them more firm and specific. And so the final version is certainly rooted in those NACE competencies, but not limited to them.
Cool, great, thanks. Neil.
Yeah, a colleague of mine and I, actually Greg, I think is on there, I've done some research on a very effective way, it appears, to improve the well-being of arts majors. We did a paper 4 years ago at a conference in Europe. And the really easy answer is to encourage our students to do double majors. You know, it's not a cost to you folks in terms of developing new courses. It's not a cost to the university. They already have these courses because these other majors already exist. And it can enhance their abilities to succeed financially. I'm not going to necessarily talk about as artists, but financially in the labor market if they have a second major, especially if that second major is outside the arts. So it's something perhaps Furman and other universities should really consider in terms of, it appears, at least from a very rough estimate, increasing their earnings from about 20% for if you're only a single art major, or by about 10% on an annual basis if you double major in it where the second major is outside the arts. So it's something that you and perhaps others should think about. And actually, we've done some more details in terms of categorizing what that second major is, and we could talk about that at some other time.
Neil, that's wonderful. I really appreciate you pointing me to that citation, and I will definitely look at your paper. That is one of the things that we have done, is we have rearranged the major to make it more compatible as a double major, and about 70% of our studio majors are double majors. So that is a fantastic thing. I would love to be able to point them to and say, here's some grounded facts. So thank you.
Sure.
Yeah, Neil, thank you for sharing that. Please send that our way. Send that information our way. I'd love to see that. That's fantastic.
Okay. All right, I'll get it to Doug and he can distribute what we've got.
Thank you so much.
And stay tuned in session 5 later today. We've got Greg and Neil will be presenting more of their stuff. But I think, they can provide you guys some nice ammunition, if not actual inspiration. So let's use it. But we have time. Hopefully at the end, we can come back and continue all this. I want to jump over to Jeremy now, who is going to start the clock for his talk. Go ahead, Jeremy. Thank you.
So can everybody see that? Okay, sounds good. Cool. So my paper is called Strategic Alignment in Arts Higher Education, Embedding Core Competencies Artists Must Possess to Survive in a Portfolio Economy. So artist students ultimately choose higher education in order to build upon and investigate talent and skills relating to one or more kinds of artistic practice. In other words, they choose to invest time and money in building artistic skills in the hopes of trying to translate that growth over the course of their time in college to some sort of creative practice on the end side of things. Their choice to enroll in higher education arts programs, we can assume, reflects one of, or maybe the sort of the totality of 3 logical interests. One of those would be to build a portfolio of work. The second would be to improve their creative praxis and do so alongside a cohort of similar peers and mentors in a space where other creators are making work. And lastly, to try to figure out how to operate in a post-graduation world of creatively oriented careers, maybe defining that as they will, because the traditional careers that they've looked for might be different now. Meanwhile, a sort of real-world artist market exists outside of the studios, practice rooms, and classrooms of the art departments. Of the logical interests that I just mentioned, these artist students have, the arts, of the logical interests that I mentioned above that these students have. Art programs have been largely focused and oriented towards developing students towards the first 2, portfolio building and the improvement of their creative praxis, but maybe not necessarily the third, although that's emerging more and more, which is integrating with and operating in the world after they graduate. So in order to better prepare art students, I try to propose that we must orient programs to integrate the and practice skills and to learn these core adaptability competencies that they'll find necessary to survive, if not thrive, after graduating. as they enter artistic markets and a creative workforce that is increasingly digital. Work is fragmented and non-traditional. But I do have to emphasize that I'm not arguing that the traditional outcomes that programs have had are not worthwhile, especially in the context of accreditation demands that we're all faced with. I know this particularly because the Department of Music at Wayne State just went through an accreditation process by NASM, but that there are opportunities that exist to integrate adaptability practice along the breadth of the curriculum, and not in, for instance, a single course or experience. Ultimately, this paper is conceptual in that I'm trying to synthesize prior knowledge in this area to lean towards some practical suggestions that arts programs can try to implement. I used a number of evaluative models borrowed from my background in the academic study of business surrounding strategic management and the strategic management of organizations, both for and nonprofit, and ultimately trying to propose a course of action to align those curriculum along the student experience as they go through them towards some career readiness outcomes. In terms of the data that I'm basing some of this argument upon, it's largely based upon findings from the Strategic National Arts Alumni Project, or SNAP. I did run a pilot survey using a question battery similar to SNAP and administered it internationally to about 1,000 respondents. I haven't had the chance to do the statistical checks on that to check whether or not it's representative, but at first glance, it seems like they back up the findings of SNAP. Both surveys uncovered concerns about career preparedness, especially in work that some of the folks in this room have already done in this field. Both Alexandre, Frenette, Rachel Skaggs, and others have published work relating to this. Postgraduates, when they were surveyed in SNAP, perceived specific gaps in their collegiate training. These gaps were related not towards the part of their artistic learning or their artistic praxis or creative praxis, but rather towards career readiness and resiliency. You can see on the chart here, one of the largest gaps perceived was in financial and business management skills, not to mention gaps in entrepreneurial skills, relationship building and networking, technological skills, persuasive speaking, project management, leadership, and others. And the respondents found frustration with a lack of resources in those areas. And in an international survey, at least, noted a willingness to take additional coursework to be better prepared for navigating the job market after graduation. That being said, I'm trying to propose that we don't necessarily need to add on a 5th year, maybe, of coursework in order to make that happen. There's a strong, yet still somewhat emergent body of research that exists there where students have mentioned a need for social engagement and career skills. There's discussion of the worth of careers not closely linked to traditional and current outcomes. The students feel unrewarded for the work that they've put in towards graduation once they come out of their higher education program and are faced with the career options and their perceived readiness for that. Most poignantly, maybe Douglas Dempster mentions that programs seem to fail to prepare students for the realistic blended professional lives they are bound to pursue. And reading and seeing some of these results and seeing quotes like that in the research, the body of literature, sort of made me try to think of how I could apply these areas of, or the work of strategic management, which is trying to essentially problem solve and present solutions towards figuring out what these programs could actually do. So I used a series in the paper. I use a series of strategic analyses. I will mention two of these specific analyses to try to answer some of these questions. So borrowing from Michael Porter's research on competitive forces, how does the ecosystem of the graduate and the program affect competition? How do programs organize themselves to create value for graduates? Using the idea of value chain analysis so that the resources can be directed towards creating graduates that are able to sustain themselves afterwards. What are the core competencies that students need and can transact on? How do we ensure that programs are organized to deliver students with those core competencies? And are there technical systems, employee skills, this would be instructor skills or administrative skills, managerial systems or values and norms that might cause problems or roadblocks, or may ultimately help us push the conversation forward? Ultimately, it's based on an idea in strategy called the resource-based view. Essentially that the organization of resources reflective of the current ecosystem can deliver on a graduate that is able to thrive in the sort of diverse economy that or the economic situation that they're faced with. This example here is a sort of modified version of Porter's 5 forces that looks at all the sort of competitive forces that push up against the arts programs as they're moving forward. The idea that we don't exist as arts programs in a vacuum necessarily. The students that are coming into the program have specific power. You know, obviously, without students in our programs, we don't have a program that exists. We need to be able to be responsive to those. The power of suppliers, so educators, administrators, community institutions, all have a force that affects our arts programs. And there are a number of sort of other forces that all push in on how a arts program may be competitive in trying to create these students which are competitive on the long term. We have to deal with government rules, federal education rules regarding Pell Grants and course plans, accreditation, funding requirements, and the existence of a whole breadth of educational opportunities outside of what we're doing in the classroom. All of these are competitive forces we must look at. Essentially, my argument is that we can align the curriculum sort of across the breadth of the student experience, so across all of their coursework towards those career success outcomes, to help students develop technical skills, the sort of base foundation of what they're trying to learn via praxis, theory, history. We can strengthen the sort of core competencies that they need to survive in the quote unquote real world afterwards via practice over the course of time, and not just in a single class at the end, but by integrating these ideas within coursework sort of from the get-go. Resiliency competencies, experiential practice sort of from the beginning, and weaving those in with the creative competencies that ultimately lead towards graduates who are better at accepting risks, who have more of a sense of self-agency and action. They don't need to be given solutions, but can sort of figure them out on their own in another way of talking about problem solving. So turning towards what can we do? We can encourage the practice of effectual skills. Those of you who are scholars in entrepreneurship know about the world of effectuation, the research of Sarah Sarasvathy. But we can sort of try to encourage them to create with what they have around them. So developing ideas without funding or specialized tools. Obviously, that's a stopping point for many for artists, especially if you push them into a class where they feel like they want to create something, but they don't have the ability to. Starting early, as I've mentioned, because comfortability with risk is built over time, and creating numerous opportunities to do so. They can increase the practice of self-agency by sort of pulling away from the gatekeeping sort of juries and portfolio reviews that we are normally doing, and make a more consistent practice of artistic output that presents work in the external community much more often, possibly using real-time case studies versus sort of the afterwards case studies. So we should embed things that are socially relevant in the classroom right now, rather than trying to look afterwards to say, okay, what happened here? How do we figure? There's value in that too, but the sort of real time helps students realize that there are risky situations and there are problems to be solved in real time, and going through that with the instructor as a mentor. Building social capital and network building. So the idea of thematic semesters, which can align the technical and historical coursework and the praxis coursework for large groups of students. You know, you may have, I come from the world of music, you may have 200 students in an introductory theory class. How can you, or introductory music history class, you can put them together in kind of a cohort and have them work on problems and community orientation over the course of those classes. And then just trying to embed skill building across the entire curriculum again. The idea of granting repetitive credit for synthesis kind of courses, where students are sort of brought up through the process of running galleries, theaters, record labels, and performance spaces with real income and real losses. Some of the work that, for instance, Millikan and other institutions have been starting to investigate. I have a couple more slides, but I'll stop here.
I guess my earlier threat might have worked. Well, thank you, Jeremy. Much appreciated. Let's make sure we get some time for some questions, and maybe someone will anticipate one of your later slides and can ask you about it. You get a minute more for it.
Sure.
Let's see if we get some hands virtually or some chat questions posted from the room, which is up to 18 people I see. And if you'd like, Jeremy, while we wait for that. Oh, here we go. Alex has a great question. Go ahead and ask.
I will ask. Thank you, Jeremy. That was great. I was just curious because in your paper you do talk a little bit more about gatekeeping, and so I hope you could expand a little bit more on that. Maybe that was one of the other slides about how to better prepare students to deal with this constantly changing landscape of gatekeepers. And I'll let you speak about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of that comes to some of that, I guess I would say, looks toward trying to get students to, if they're working in, say, a gallery that might, the building itself might be owned by a university or an institution, because we're good at owning spaces like that. But the operations of the institution are run by students. They're going to be experiencing a diverse sort of network of economic actors, I guess. So you have to figure out how to promote and market and ticket a event at a gallery or a theater. If you are working at a record label, there's a number of digital platforms that you have to consider. Does it make sense to put put out a release on these things? If we can help mentor them through that process and do so over the course of their career and not just on a sort of capstone, I think they'll become more adept at dealing with the sort of new, sort of reaching back to what you were saying, the sort of new gatekeepers that are existing. I sort of pulled that out of the presentation because of some feedback I got from the paper review process that I was trying to do too many things at once. So that's why I didn't talk about it there. But yeah, it definitely feels like there's sort of new sets of gatekeepers. We've talked about how the digital economy's ripped apart the traditional gatekeepers, but there's all these brand new digital gatekeepers that are existing, and there's these signal to noise issues that artists are facing, and we would do well to train artists to deal with that as we're trying to educate them.
By the way, just a final little comment here. Also, I want to add that most of us, when we write a paper, have too many things going on in them. But I just want to point out that I think that particular angle, it would be a really good contribution to the field to just kind of write a paper specifically about that.
Yeah, that's sort of what I'm just going to kind of pull that out and then write a new paper just based on that.
Yeah, I think one of the big transformations or evolutions in so much of the arts sector is about the changing and evolving roles of gatekeepers. And record labels aren't what they were anymore, but that doesn't mean we don't have new gatekeepers. They just take a different form. We have time for one more question. If anyone wants to jump in.
Thanks for that suggestion, by the way.
Rachel, take it away.
Yeah, I'll jump in. Thank you for your paper, Jeremy. So one of the things that I was thinking about is I'm also kind of coming from a music perspective if I'm applying my research to any particular case. But could you speak maybe to if you have thoughts about kind of arts-wide, different genres, different media, if you see any different or specific cases that stand out to you, or do you see this theory as being widely applicable kind of because it's a theory of education?
I think it might be more, so actually this maybe points towards some of the conclusions in the end slide suggestions. But the idea that I think it could apply maybe across curriculum. There's areas where we can sort of create new career pathways for students in terms of, the idea of mixing the study of jazz and creativity and improvisation with how health professionals do problem solving on the fly in trauma surgery, for example. The idea, and actually this is borrowed from some research that happened at the University of Michigan, a paper artist who is a friend of mine published a paper in Nature Communications where he worked with some of the developers of a very thin solar arrays and used the techniques of kirigami to help it by stretching very low power meet the sun where it needs to be to get the most efficient use of the solar array designs. So areas like that, I think, are where these sort of things can be applicable outside of programs, and where we need to, as arts programs, help students realize that, hey, this paper cutting work that you've been studying and gluing paper actually can be, you can be a consultant on top of your creative practice and help in these situations and sort of use that portfolio career mentality, whether you subscribe to it or not, to sort of have that as a significant income source that can support the core creative practice that you're doing otherwise.
Great, thank you.
Great. Thanks, Jeremy. All right, let's turn over to our third paper in this session by Alex Furnet, Rachel Skaggs, and Megan Robinson, all three of whom are in the virtual room, and I'll let you just take it away, Alex.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you, Doug and Joanna, for organizing this wonderful session or this conference. Thank you for also noting that this is a collaborative project. The co-authors are Rachel Skaggs from Ohio State University and soon to be Dr. Megan Robinson, soon to be sociology PhD from Vanderbilt, who's on here as well. So if you have any questions, really tough questions about stats, I'm very grateful to pass the baton over to her to answer those. I'm amazed at the overlap between these three papers in this session. Essentially, this is also about this kind of mismatch or discrepancy between the skills that students perceive they were able to develop while they were in school and the skills that they need in their artistic practice or their artistic career. And I was struck by this mismatch when I first became involved with SNAP more than 5 years ago now. And I'm just showing you the more extreme mismatches, which thankfully Jeremy already discussed, which is that only about a quarter of arts graduates say their higher education institution helped them develop these financial and business management skills, as well as entrepreneurial skills. But most of these alumni say that they use and need these skills in their professional life. At the other extreme, I was just slightly surprised to see that the vast majority of graduates are very satisfied with the artistic technique skills that they developed, but out of the 16 skills and abilities that SNAP asks about, this is the only one for which there was actually a surplus, right, in artistic technique. So these mismatches, particularly this huge gap in terms of business and entrepreneurial skills, didn't really make sense to me because, as we all know, artists are entrepreneurs, even though we don't necessarily all like that word or wish to identify as an entrepreneur. Research on artistic careers has long showed that artists build careers by being entrepreneurial. They identify and seek out opportunities, they take risks, and must be comfortable with change. And by being entrepreneurial, I also mean that artists have to be exceptionally nimble, flexible workers. Compared to other professional workers, they're disproportionately likely to hold multiple jobs at once, to experience intermittent periods of unemployment and or underemployment, to become self-employed, and to nimbly combine again, various types of work that can include arts, non-arts, and arts related, like arts teaching and administration. So of course, I am not the only person, as you can see, there are at least 3 people who have thought about this. I'm not the only person who has been thinking about this and puzzled by these skill gaps. There have been important debates in post-secondary arts education, whether there should be more of a focus on these types of skills as opposed to focusing mostly or solely on intense, rigorous artistic technique. And essentially what has been called for over the last decade or two has been more professional development and career skills at art schools in order to help students navigate these highly entrepreneurial artistic labor markets. One person who's been a vocal advocate for these types of changes is Doug Dempster, who's already been mentioned. He's the dean at UT Austin, also the head of the SNAP board. And he, at a conference a decade ago, it was a summit on music entrepreneurship education, he said, quote, "We are naturally concerned about our students graduating into a hyper-competitive winner-take-all marketplace without the skills and knowledge that could give them the competitive edge needed to succeed." He goes on, "It makes little sense to drive art students through a highly regimented curriculum that affords few choices and asks them for little individual initiative, and then expect them to flourish in a world that rewards creativity, opportunism, experimentation, and distinctiveness more than anything else. In short, an entrepreneurial world." So this has been sort of the key tension. How do we help prepare, and I say we, I'm not an arts educator, but I study them. And how do we prepare people, these art students, for the world of work? What is the exact burden or distribution of responsibility on the part of higher ed? I think that as Sarah's case study demonstrated, and as Doug's quote and work has shown, there is a lot of sincere interest in just making sure that one's students are very successful once they graduate, and that what they learn they consider valuable. So I'm not doubting the sincerity of these efforts, but sociologically, I should also add that there's more context to these debates and changes to curricula. Specifically 2 points. One is that due to large scale technological and changes in the economy, earning a college degree has become especially important for workers to avoid or fend off what we call precarious work or bad jobs. And secondly, as college graduates increasingly face uncertain times in this transition from school to work, institutions of higher ed face significant pressures on the part of parents, students, as well as policymakers more broadly to improve student outcomes. So taking these 2 points together, I just want to point out that post-secondary curricula in the arts, but but beyond the arts, are shifting in an effort to prepare students for the increasingly uncertain and risky labor markets these students will soon confront. So for a variety of reasons, arts entrepreneurship offerings were relatively rare as recently as the early 2000s, but have since grown dramatically. According to research by Linda Essig, in 2016, 37% of schools of art, music, and design, and 31% of research universities in the US offered at least some kind of arts entrepreneurship programming. And this rapid adoption of arts entrepreneurship education is partly enabled by its ambiguity. It means many different things within higher education. There are many different understandings of what and approaches to arts entrepreneurship as a subdiscipline or as transdiscipline, as an economy or a continuum between new venture creation and career self-management in artists' attempts to navigate the market. So sometimes arts entrepreneurship offerings are housed in an academic department. Sometimes it's at a center, sometimes it's career services. The growth of entrepreneurial offerings comes in many different forms. So you have curricular programming like courses and degrees, but then you also have co-curricular programming like pitch competitions, symposia, incubators. So by the way, all this I think makes sense because there are different types of offerings, in part because among other reasons, because there are many different types of entrepreneurs. Right, so we have new venture founders, other self-employed workers like freelancers, as well as the within firm innovators, the intrapreneurs, which I will not talk about, but I realize that is another important group. So using SNAP data, what we did was we ran a series of mixed effects logistic regression models to answer two key questions. First, have more recent cohorts of arts alumni attained different skills than earlier graduates? Basically, has there been a payoff to this rise in arts entrepreneurship programming? Are we seeing differences in terms of these mismatches that I talked about previously? And secondly, how does this actually connect with different kind of entrepreneurial career outcomes? Are different entrepreneurial outcomes, meaning founding a nonprofit or for-profit on one hand, or becoming a freelancer on the other hand, associated with different types of skill profiles? So to answer these questions, we're using SNAP, Strategic National Arts Alumni Project data, which is a cross-sectional survey, and we're focusing on a subsample of responses from the 2015, 16, and 17 waves of SNAP, looking specifically at over 25,000 arts alumni who graduated between 1976 and 2017. And at the time of filling out the survey, they were all currently working professional artists. And this is a working paper. I believe the findings are robust, but please don't quote the exact percentages. They will change as we refine the models. So on the very first slide, I talked about these kind of 6 variables, which are skill acquisition related to artistic, business, and entrepreneurial skills. Students say they acquired them, some are very much, or did not acquire them by saying very little or not at all. And there's another key variable, which is skill use in work life. For each artistic and business and entrepreneurial skills, alumni were asked to what extent these skills are important to effectively perform in their work life. So ultimately, we have, for each of the 3 skills, 4 new variables, which is skill match, skill gap, skill excess, and skill disregard. We're particularly interested in the skill match, which is where they say they develop these skills while they're in school and they're using them in their work life, as well as the skill gap, which is where they did not acquire these skills and they use them, nevertheless, in their work life. In terms of basic descriptive statistics, this is a different version of what you saw previously in the table, which is that, yeah, most arts graduates say, 95% of them say they acquired artistic skills, some are very much. So there's very little excess or gap that has been noted. But for business skills, it's a very different story. 23% only say they acquired business skills, but most of them need these skills. So there's a huge skills gap for business skills, and it's similar, though maybe not quite as pronounced, for entrepreneurial skills. And quickly, the career outcomes, I mentioned these 2 entrepreneurial profiles. There's a question that asks, have you ever been a founder of a nonprofit or for-profit? There's also a question that basically asks, have you ever been self-employed? And we removed those who had ever been founders from that category. So basically 71% of people have ever been a freelancer, but not founders. And 90% of the sample as a whole, at some point, has been a founder or a freelancer, which is consistent with what prior research suggests about these entrepreneurial artistic careers. So to answer the first question about are we seeing changes over time, controlling for sociodemographic characteristics, institutions, majors, and educational experiences, we find that yes, there has been a change over time. The cohort variable is a little bit weird. These are bunched in 5 years, 5-year categories. So people who graduate in between 2013 and 2017 are 3% more likely to develop entrepreneurial skills compared to those who graduated in 2008 to 2012, and so on. So consistently over time, we've seen about, on average, a 3% increased likelihood in developing your entrepreneurial skills. Okay, so there's a bit of a catch here, which is that recent graduates are 15% less likely to acquire artistic techniques, some or very much. So these results corroborate the view that art students are increasingly likely to engage with entrepreneurial offerings, though at a, I'd say, somewhat surprising cost. Just a couple of quick notes. There are variations by major, but mostly I wanted to talk about how special focus schools like conservatories and design schools seem to be particularly focused on artistic skill acquisition. And in fact, if you stay at one of these institutions, you have 56% increased likelihood in developing your artistic skill acquisition, as opposed to if you go to an R1 doctoral institution, but you're also less likely or you have decreased odds of developing business skills. All right, I'm going to spend a few minutes here talking about the second main question, which is on career outcomes. So by skills, we're looking at whether certain characteristics and conditions predict the odds of 2 different career outcomes, becoming a founder and becoming a freelancer. I got 3 minutes, you got it. The results suggest 2 very distinct career outcomes like these. Although they're both entrepreneurial work arrangements, they're linked to 2 very different types of skill profiles. Business skills gaps, as well as entrepreneurial skill gaps and matches, are significant and positively associated with becoming a founder. But conversely, skill gaps, matches, and excesses about between artistic technique learned in school and what you need in your work are very significant and linked to increased likelihood of becoming freelancers. So to kind of summarize, what I think is the most controversial finding here is that there are differences in terms, at least between these 2 general types of cultural entrepreneurs, which reflect predominant orientations towards and preoccupations with the commercial for founders and the artistic for freelancers. Although I know this is a bit of an overgeneralization. Briefly, which educational experiences are associated with becoming a founder or a freelancer? Well, the pattern by major is rather clear. Basically, every major except architecture and design is significantly more likely to become a founder, but there's no difference in terms of becoming a freelancer. I talked about special focus schools. That's no longer significant in terms of predicting who becomes a freelancer or a founder. But if you have a graduate degree, you are more likely to become a founder and less likely to become a freelancer. And finally, in terms of sociodemographic variables, I don't have time to talk about all of them, but I do want to mention being a first-generation college graduate is linked to decreases in both becoming a founder and becoming a freelancer, which I think is not exactly surprising, but disappointing. In line with previous research on artistic careers, basically we show that breaking into and sustaining careers in the creative industries often requires periods of unemployment and underemployment, and this high prevalence of these economic blows makes it disproportionately more difficult for people, first generation, lower SES graduates to break in. So just to conclude then, following the widespread emergence of arts entrepreneurship programming at institutions of higher ed, ostensibly with the aim to better prepare art students for their post-college careers, this paper shows that more recent graduates are more likely to report acquiring entrepreneurial skills while at school, but they're also decreasingly likely to be satisfied with their artistic skill acquisition. So this is something hopefully we can discuss. Further, while entrepreneurial skill gaps seem to be highly prevalent in the arts, they really only seem to concern founders. Founders are significantly more preoccupied with entrepreneurial and business skills, whereas freelancers, which is the majority of arts graduates, are more likely to report significant matches or mismatches in artistic technique. And then finally, first-gen college graduates, as I mentioned, are less likely to become founders and or freelancers, which should cause concern for those who care about diversity in the arts. Further research is needed to disentangle the push and pull factors in artistic entrepreneurship and how these intersect with skills as well as class, gender, and race. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Alex. Very good. I'm sure we have lots of questions because I'm sure of this because I have lots of questions. So, but let's start with other people with their better questions first, please. Anyone want to jump in? You have to move quick because otherwise I'm going to go with mine. Anyone? There you go, Monica, please.
So I teach these type of classes, and being in the arts, I know what you're talking about. The thing that is the hard part, and why there is such a discrepancy, is because of the product that's being sold. Obviously, it's easy to be entrepreneurial about something else that's not you. So the issue with transferring these entrepreneurship skills is that you have to sell yourself as the product, and somehow, in the artist community, it's deeply entrenched that if you have to sell your product, there might be something wrong with it because it should speak for itself. If you're great, everybody knows. So it's a very tricky issue with honing those entrepreneurial skill and your self-perception that needs to change from the foundation. And I think that's something to address. It's not as easy as putting a class out there and yay, here's how you sell it and this is how you do it. You still have to figure out how to toot your own horn, so to say, how to be as confident as you can. And this is where, maybe taking away from the artistic skills gets tricky. So traditionally, the way you're perceived as great is if your peers endorse you. But if you're too good at the entrepreneurial skills, your peers might not endorse you. So let's talk about this for a second.
Oh, it's a fascinating point. Thank you so much. And I'm sorry, I will probably do violence to your beautiful argument because I'm thinking about this in terms of sociological theory, which has argued for long about these two competing kind of logics, the commercial and the artistic, art for art's sake type of logic within the arts, and specifically within art schools tends to be historically focused more on the art for art's sake approach, which I realize is a bit of an oversimplification. But thank you for bringing this up because there are two key points here that I didn't have time to talk about, which is one, the issue of culture, the culture within arts institutions, precisely what is valued, and essentially is it seen as selling out, or is it seen as not properly performing your role as a artist in becoming, to sell yourself, right? And the second issue is one of identity. I didn't talk about them, but there are findings by gender and by race, ethnicity, which suggests that, for example, men seem way more comfortable claiming that they got certain types of entrepreneurial skills. Rachel Skaggs will be writing more about this kind of difference in confidence between men and women in entrepreneurship, but may there be some of these kind of individual level characteristics that also shape the performance of selling yourself without seeming like you're selling yourself that you're talking about, which is really important.
Jeremy, get your hand up.
Sort of to that last point you just mentioned about the differences of gender. And I realize that you can't rewrite history and go back and change this, but I was wondering if you, in those findings that were at least gender oriented, I was wondering if you found problems with the dichotomous nature of how SNAP categorized gender, especially considering a perceived prevalence of gender fluidity in artistic creation.
Right. So there's two parts to the answer. One side is that SNAP, in some ways, maybe was slightly ahead of its time, at least in having a third category, which was another gender identity. But the problem there is that less than half of 1% selected that option. So we could have had, there is maybe a little bit of data on that, but unfortunately, in terms of running these kind of sophisticated regression models, it just doesn't hold using such a small box, if you will.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that gender question too, because I was surprised to see the results, partly based on stuff that Joanna and I have done looking at self-employment rates. And one of the things we found with gender was that whether it wasn't, and I was also interested in the marriage effect, because we found that there was no overall marriage effect on these rates, but there was only when interacted with gender. So it made a difference whether you were the wife or the husband in those traditional normal situations. I shouldn't say normal, the more traditional situations. We got a question from Ben Tosher. I'm not sure if Ben wants me to read this out loud because he hasn't even turned on his video. So unless he jumps in, he's going to jump in. Very good.
Yeah, here we go. I'm just going to jump
Ben.
in there. Hi, thanks. I'll just read the question. First of all, great presentation. Super interesting with the skills gap. I'm wondering if your data has the ability to disambiguate between the different types of arts entrepreneurship that were taught to these respondents at each institution. So whether it was the new venture or the career transitioning or this being enterprising, and whether it does or whether it's not, I'm wondering if you could maybe just talk about on how you think that might affect the different freelancing versus founding outcomes that you explore, which is really interesting.
That's a fascinating point. Thank you. Unfortunately, there is no way to, because, okay, so I'll take a step back. We are kind of mapping out kind of the way that Linda Essig did, which of the SNAP institutions offer what kind of programming, and find that, first of all, things have changed a lot since 2016. Only 46 of the 101 SNAP institutions were in Linda Essig's data set, but something like 95% of them offer some type of arts entrepreneurship offering. But the problem is with the SNAP data, we could look and see if some of the schools that offer certain types of, either curricular or co-curricular are linked to different types of outcomes, but we don't know for sure which of these types of offerings these particular alumni engaged in. So it's really tricky. I think the second part of your question was to what extent these different types of offerings might lead to or be linked to different types of outcomes. I mean, I have various thoughts, but I have no scientifically kind of backed evidence on what leads to what. There may be some kind of self-selection going on, but I see Rachel Skaggs' hand is up, so I'd rather defer to her.
I just have a kind of side comment of something that we've taken out of the paper, which might answer this a little bit, and that's the variable that is called resource. So one of the SNAP questions asks, what resource did you most need or do you most need in your career? And so it looks at things like networks, marketing oneself, business and capital. There are others as well, but I think those are some of the larger ones, physical space. And we did find that there are differences between founders and freelancers on which resources they say they need to be successful. So that doesn't totally get at your question, but it does kind of indicate that there might be other differences that are not explored in current literature around the kinds of differences of what people need and what might lead them to be able to attract one type of work versus the other.
Yeah. Great point. And by the way, thank you, Ben. I've read a few of your papers. I appreciate them. And Doug, I want to mention that when we were writing up this paper, it was after I read the finding about gender and marital status when we were writing it up, as opposed to when we're doing the analysis. But we'll check for an interaction there because that's a fascinating point.
Interaction terms are a very cheap thing to do. Okay, we've got 5 minutes left. And so I want to make sure we have a chance to open it back up for any of the 3 papers we've seen. Any questions you have, whether it's on Alex et al.'s paper, Jeremy's, or the first paper from Sarah et al. Tal has a question.
Okay, thanks. So actually, my question is to Alexandre on the last paper. I was wondering what you think is the role of the industry, the structural structure of the industry. Since, I mean, from a research I'm presenting in the last session with Joanna, we found that artists are usually are more likely to get pushed to freelance and self-employment due to structural characteristic of the industry. So can it be that the fact that you find that people who say that are lacking skills are more freelance is actually maybe the opposite causality? People who are pushed towards being freelancing are blaming it, like doing this projection of the reasons on the external, and they think that, okay, I didn't get enough skills, so I couldn't find a job and I had to go freelance. But it's not necessarily the case that they are really maybe objectively different in their skills from people who got job in the industry.
Right. Oh, that's a great point. And I'm not, and Rachel and Megan might disagree with me here, but I'm not particularly, I don't believe so forcefully in the direction of this particular effect, but the fact that there's an association I find fascinating, because it is people's self-perceived fit in terms of skills that they acquired and need. So there may be a link here. I think that this will be better teased out by looking at interactions by gender, race, and socioeconomic status. I think that will maybe help bring that more clarity in terms of the push and pull factors, and that's coming next for us. Thank you.
And we've got time for one more question for someone. Neil.
Yeah, I'm going to stick out my neck here as a non-arts educator and raise a very particular question. Some early studies, or a study that my colleague and I did about early in the last decade, suggests that fewer than 20% of most arts majors, with the exception of two arts, what we classified as arts majors, don't work in the arts, don't have an arts job. What does all of this focus, how does it help the other 80%, or even more so, in various arts majors who don't become artists, even over their entire career? We have graphs that can show, or tables that can show that people change from being artists to out of artists to back into artists over their career. And it's very interesting to see how that varies from art major to art major. But you're talking about, with the exception of architects, and I think primarily people who major in architecture and people who major in design, you're talking about less than 20% work essentially as artists. What benefit are they going to get from these initiatives, which perhaps are probably very good and valuable for those who do end up being artists, but what about for the rest of your majors? Sorry.
This might be one of the rare opportunities where actually one of the other two speakers could speak to this, but I think that
Alex, this wasn't directed just at you. It was directed at everybody.
Well, Neil, exactly. That's the point for us. Being a liberal arts school, they don't come to Furman University to study art. And so we had to kind of do a deep dive and do a very vulnerable take on, what role do we serve here, right? And so that's what really got us to do those deep, empathetic conversations within our department. How do we fit and try to understand that? So that's kind of how we began to unpack and redevelop our whole entire curriculum and outlook. And it came down to entrepreneurship, innovation, creativity, resilience through making, a lot of ways in those conversations, and how it fit with the rest of the university to prop up their educational pathway. And so that's where we begin to kind of tweak into how the arts are fitting for us. And, they've been talked out of it. They have been talked out of art, in at least in our market set. And so we had to re-engage them and see how it fit within their other trajectories. So I don't know if, Sarah, you wanted to speak to that at all. You're on mute.
This also comes to the point, as we were talking before, about double majors. Right, most of our students at Furman are not going to become artists. They're not going to become arts educators. They're going to go into some other field. And so for us, the impetus was really to demonstrate, well, how can studying the arts benefit these other career paths? And that's where it really came down to the entrepreneurial mindset and the idea of competencies. And so I was really interested, Alex, in the statistics you were showing about the gap and the sort of excess gap in technique, because I feel like that really falls right into the sort of argument that we've been making on our campus, is that yes, technique is important. However, the arts contribute something else to a liberal arts education. And we're in a very specific market that's different than the sort of conservatory model or even a BFA model. But for us, that statistic really hit home.
Right.
Okay. Oh, sorry. I'm gonna jump in only
okay.
because I'm the designated timekeeper, and I have two priorities here. One is to make sure we give a big round of applause and thank you to all of our speakers. Let's do that first. Thank you. Well done. These are great talks. And fascinating papers. And are coming back in 14 minutes in either sessions A3 or B3 for the next round. And this room stays open, so if you want to linger behind and ask or answer questions, you're welcome to do so. Some of us are going to rush out and make a quick ham sandwich and come back in or something, because I think session 3 is where we get to watch each other eat while we present, because we don't have a lunch break in here. So thank you all. Great session, and please feel free to keep chatting.